From the early 20th century to the modern battlefield, the US military has evolved its operational art, refining warfare strategies to near perfection. Throughout history, military success has depended on mastering the first grammar of war, the principles and strategies that define victory. The US armed forces have continuously improved their art, learning from the past conflicts and adapting to new challenges. So, today we'll be discussing American operational art 1917 to 2008. It is written by Ottilio J. Echeverria. We will be discussing this into eight parts, that is the Great War, interwar period, the Second World War, Korean War conflict, the Vietnam conflict, the limited war, that is during the Cold War era, the Afghanistan, and the Second Persian Gulf War. The Great War. At the outbreak of World War I, United States military was far from ready for large-scale industrial age war. The US Army was a modest force, just 1 lakh men with little combat experience. The Navy, though stronger, was focused on battleships, not the modern warfare. When US entered the war in 1917, mobilization was slow. Both the Allies and Germany believed America wouldn't make a real impact until 1990. But they were wrong. Despite the challenges, the American Expeditionary Force deployed as an independent army, and by mid 1918, they were in combat. Early battles at Cantigny, Chateau Thierry, and Belleau gave US troops their first taste of the modern warfare. But the real test came with the two major offensives: the Saint Mihiel offensive in September 12th, 1918, when 14 divisions backed by the massive artillery, air power, and tanks launched an attack. The Germans were already retreating, but the US forces captured 15,000 prisoners at a cost of about 7,000 casualties. Then was the Meso-Oregon Offensive, September 26, 1918, a much larger assault with over 1.25 million US troops. Facing rugged terrain and fierce German resistance, it was slow, brutal, but played a key role in forcing Germany to seek peace. So the success came at a cost. The AEF's command structure was plagued by inexperience, slow decision making, and rigid tactics. Many commanders stuck to the plan instead of adapting to the chaos of the battle. Communications and the logistic failures made coordination difficult. Meanwhile, the US Navy had to evolve. Traditional battleship tactics weren't enough, so they had to counter German U boats along with the Royal Navy. This meant rapid expansion, reorganization, and a new strategic focus on anti submarine warfare. So, World War One forced the US military to evolve. It had to master operational art, joint coordination, and modern logistics. Lessons that would shape the future military strategy for generations to come. So, overall, the Great War shaped the US military. So, we will move ahead to explore more defining moments in the history. Then came the interwar period. In this section of the chapter, the discussion is on the evolution of military thought and operational art between World War I and World War II. This period was marked by significant innovation in strategy, tactics, and technology as nations sought to address the lessons learned from the Great War, that is World War I, and prepare for the future conflicts. World War I was a brutal lesson in the military strategy. Millions of lives were lost in a static trench warfare where battles dragged for months with little progress. The war exposed the flaws of the traditional military tactics, forcing nations to rethink the way wars were fought. The message was clear: modern warfare demands mobility, speed, and new technologies to avoid catastrophic deadlocks of the past. So the technology came in. The first major breakthrough, the technology, the tanks, mechanized vehicles brought the promise of mobility and firepower. Aircrafts evolved from the reconnaissance tools to deadly combat machines. These advancements hinted at a new way of fighting, one that could break through the enemy lines instead of being trapped in defensive trenches. The thinkers who shaped the modern warfare or the theoretical development, great military minds began shaping the future of warfare. JFC Muller and Basil Hart, we have seen these people in the earlier chapters also, envisioned armed forces piercing through the enemy defenses, supported by infantry and air power. It was hence Guderian who took it further, developing the concept of blitzkrieg or lightning war. Fast moving, heavily armed divisions could strike deep, disrupt enemy lines, and collapse enemy forces from within. Some nations embraced these ideas. Germany, despite the Treaty of Versailles, secretly developed powerful panzer divisions and perfected rapid mechanized warfare. Others, like France and Britain, clung to the defensive strategies, investing in massive fortifications like the Maginot Line, trying to prevent another war of attrition. But the next war would not be fought in trenches. It would be fought with speed, precision, and overwhelming force. The rise of air power. War was no longer confined to the battlefield. Air power had emerged as a game changer. Visionaries like the Goliath believed that strategic bombing could cripple an enemy's industry and morale before ground forces even engaged. This theory reshaped global military doctrines, leading to the development of massive air forces capable of reshaping the battlefield from the skies. So, the interwar period was a transformative era of the military strategy and operational art, driven by technological innovation and critical analysis of the World War I. The groundwork laid during this time, particularly in the mechanized warfare and air power, played a pivotal role in shaping the strategies of the World War II. The contrasting approach among the nations underscored the varying interpretations of the past lessons and preparedness for the future conflicts. So, with this, we come to the Second World War. In this part of the chapter, it provides an in depth analysis of the key events, strategies, and the outcome during the pivotal phase of the war. It explores the military campaigns, political decisions, and the global consequences that shaped the course of conflict. As the war raged on the Axis power, the Germany, Italy, and Japan seemed unstoppable initially. But the Allied forces were about to change that. In Europe, the Soviet Union launched a powerful counteroffensive on the Eastern Front, pushing back the Nazi Germany. In the Pacific, US adopted an island hopping strategy, battling across the jungles, treacherous waters to reclaim land from Japan. The war was no longer in the Axis favor. The Axis were on the move. So the victory was just not about the firepower, it was about strategy. The US, UK, and Soviet Union worked together, sharing intelligence, coordinating attacks, and cutting off the enemy supply lines. Air superiority became game changer. Strategic bombing weakened the Axis stronghold, while naval blockades strangled their resources. So then came the D-Day, June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious invasion in history, or what we called the Normandy landing. Nazi Germany's grip on Europe began to crumble. In all this, the leadership played a very important role. The war wasn't just fought on the battlefield, it was fought in the war rooms also. Like Churchill's speeches inspired resilience. Roosevelt's strategy mobilized the US war machines. Stalin's brutal counteroffensive crushed the Nazi forces on the Eastern Front. These decisions not only helped win the war but laid the foundation for a new global order, one that would soon be divided by the Cold War tensions. The final blow, ending the war, Germany's defenses collapsed. Japan, though resilient, faced an impossible war. Then came Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the nuclear devastation that forced Japan to surrender. The world was forever changed because of this. So, World War II was not just about military battle, it was about alliances, leadership, and strategy. It shaped borders, creating superpowers, and left behind lessons that still guide global conflicts today. The war ended, but its impact lives on. So, next we see the Korean conflict. So, this part explores the role of the operational art during the first major conflict of the Cold War era. The Korean War from 1950 to 1953 demonstrated the challenges and the complexities of limited war, fought under the shadow of the nuclear weapons and ideological rivalry between the East and the West. It was a war that was never declared, a battle fought not just with the guns but with the global power struggles. The Korean War was more than just a conflict between the North and South, it was a turning point in the Cold War history. It all started on June 25th, 1950. The North Korea launched a sudden invasion of the South Korea, aiming to unite the peninsula under the communist rule. But this war was never just about Korea. It became a proxy battle between the two superpowers, the United States and its allies backing the Southern Korea. China and Soviet Union supported North Korea. What started as a regional fight quickly escalated into a global showdown between democracy and the communism. A war unlike any other war, the strategy of limited war, That is what you can say. Unlike the World War II, the Korean War was not about total conquest. It was a limited war, controlled by political constraints and looming threats of the nuclear escalation. The United Nations, led by the US, aimed to repel aggression without provoking a direct war with China or the Soviet Union. Every military decision had to be weighed carefully. Victory had limited, but one wrong move could ignite the World War III. At the outset, North Korea had the upper hand. Their surprise attack and swift movement overwhelmed the South Korean forces. UN troops were pushed back, cornered into a desperate last stand Pushan perimeter, which is shown on the slide. With the little room left to retreat, the war seemed almost lost. Then the US made its move. General MacArthur's bold counteroffensive turned the tide. The Incheon landing was a masterstroke of the military strategy, striking deep behind the enemy lines. The North Korean forces were soon forced into retreat and UN troops pushed forward. But just when the victory seemed near, a new force entered the battlefield. That is the Chinese intervention and stalemate. In late 1950s, thousands of the Chinese soldiers flooded into Korea, catching the UN forces off guard. What followed was a brutal cycle of offensives and counteroffensives, each side gaining and losing ground. Eventually, the war settled into a stalemate near the 38th parallel, the very border where it all had begun. Fighting shifted from rapid advances to defensive positions and attritional warfare. Neither side could gain a decisive advantage, but neither was willing to back down also. So there were many unseen challenges logistics, terrain, the politics. The Korean War wasn't just fought with bullets, it was a battle against nature itself. Harsh winter, steep mountains, heavy monsoons made movement difficult. Supplying troops in remote locations was a logistical nightmare. And with the political constraints shaping the military decisions, the war became a test of strategy, patience, and endurance. So the lessons learned were first was the joint and coalition operations were essential. UN forces relied on multinational cooperation. Air superiority and the naval power played a critical role in the maintaining supply lines and striking key targets. Flexible logistics and strategic adaptability became a necessity for sustaining operations far from home. So war ended in a treaty in 1953. It never truly ended. The Korean Peninsula remained divided to this date, a reminder of the war that shaped modern global politics. So the Korean War wasn't just another conflict. It was the first major battleground of the Cold War. It shaped military strategy, redefined warfare, and proved that global superpowers could never truly fight without risking everything. Even today, the echoes of this war can be heard. Next was the Vietnam conflict. The section of Vietnam conflict examines the operational and the strategic complexities of the Vietnam War, which happened from 1955 to 1975. It highlights the challenges faced by the US and its allies in fighting a protracted, unconventional war against a highly motivated and adaptive adversary in the North Vietnam and Vietcong. The Vietnam War was not just another battle, it was a war of ideology, strategy, and resilience. A war where brute military strength meant little against the determination and unconventional tactics. A war that would change how conflicts were fought forever. Vietnam War was unlike the great wars before it. It wasn't about massive tank battles or the decisive victories. It was a war of endurance where North Vietnam fought to outlast the US resolve rather than defeat it outright. With the Cold War at its peak, the war became a proxy battle between the superpowers, the US supporting the South Vietnam, and the Soviet Union and China backing the North Vietnam. This war was fought in jungles, in villages, in tunnels, and in the minds of the people. The challenges of fighting a different kind of war were the US military, the most powerful force in the world, suddenly found itself struggling against an invisible enemy. Conventional military tactics didn't work. Guerrilla warfare, ambushes, and small scale attacks made large US forces frustrated and vulnerable. The Vietcong used dense jungles, underground tunnels, networks, and support of the local population to their advantage. So the winning battle did not mean winning the war. The enemy could vanish only to strike again. Another thing is use of technology versus the terrain. The US unleashed advanced technology and overwhelming firepower. Operation Rolling Thunder as was an example of a relentless bombing campaign raining destruction on the North Vietnam. Then using of the napalm and Agent Orange, which had the chemical warfare meant to destroy the jungles and expose the enemy. Then were the helicopters and air superiority, allowing the US to strike fast and move deep quickly. But despite all this, the results were often disappointing. Bombing campaigns failed to break enemy morale and often turned the local population against the US. The technology could destroy, but it could not conquer. Realizing that the military power alone wouldn't be enough, the US tried to win over the South Vietnamese population. So, for that, they had the pacification program aimed to provide security and economic aid. Then, the strategic Hamlet program relocated villagers to the protected area. But these efforts were plagued by corruption, inefficiency, and distrust. The people were caught between two sides, fearing both Vietcong's reprisals and the American operations. The US wanted to protect them, but instead, many South Vietnamese felt like pawns in someone else's war. The North Vietnamese strategy was fighting the long game while the US relied on technology. North Vietnam relied on patience, adaptability, and the element of surprise. They attacked US forces strategically, wearing them down through attrition and psychological warfare. They operated in small, mobile units, striking where the enemy was weakest. Their knowledge of terrain and local support gave them an edge over the heavily armed US troops. Every battle chipped away at the US morale, making the war increasingly unpopular back home. So the opinion back home also mattered. Then was the politics, public opinion, and the cost of the war. Back in America, the war wasn't just fought on the battlefield, it was fought in the streets, in Congress, and on the television screens. The US government feared escalating the war too much, and then China and USA or the Soviet Union were watching closely. Then were the restrictions on the military operations limited the US forces, preventing total victory. Public support collapsed as the war dragged on. Protests erupted, and the American people demanded an end of the conflict. By early 1970s, it was clear the US was no longer fighting to win, but to leave. In 1975, Vietnam achieved its goal. The war ended and the country was unified under the communist rule. But the impact of war went far beyond Vietnam. It proved that military superiority alone cannot guarantee victory in unconventional warfare. It exposed the limits of intervention. Winning battles meant nothing if the political objectives were not clear. It changed US military strategy forever, shifting focus towards counterinsurgency and diplomacy. The Vietnam War was more than just a military conflict. It was a warning, a reminder that war isn't just fought with weapons, but with the minds, strategies, and the will to endure. So, the next part is on limited war, nuclear war, and the crisis of the operational art. So, this part examines the challenges faced by the military planners and the strategists during the nuclear age and the Cold War. It highlights how the advent of nuclear weapons and the emergence of the limited war strained the traditional concept of the operational art. The Cold War was not just a battle of ideologies, it was a global chess match where every move had the potential to spark World War III. But instead of full scale war, nations engaged in new kind of conflict, wars that were fought but never fully won. These were the limited wars of the Cold War era. So, the limited war battles in the shadow of the Cold War. Total war was no longer an option. A full scale conflict between USA and the Soviet Union could lead to global annihilation. Instead, conflicts were contained, fought through proxy wars in places like Korea and Vietnam. Political and strategic limits dictated how these wars were fought. Military commanders had to operate with strict constraint. The war was no longer about the absolute victory. They were about sending messages, holding ground, and avoiding nuclear disaster. The nuclear weapon and the game of deterrence. The rise of the nuclear weapon changed everything. Military strategy was no longer just winning battles, it was about avoiding the unthinkable. The doctrine of deterrence became the new reality where having nuclear weapons wasn't just using them, but about ensuring no one dared to. The fear of mutually assured destruction, mad as they say, meant that even the most powerful armies were forced to fight with limits. The battlefield had changed, wars had rules, but those rules came at a cost. The crisis for operational art, a new kind of war. The shift in nuclear strategy created a crisis in the military planning. Traditional operational warfare was sidelined. Winning a war no longer meant pushing forward, it meant avoiding escalation. Geopolitical considerations took over, forcing armies to make decisions not based on the battlefield needs but on the global diplomacy. Commanders had to operate under the political restriction, leading to frustration, prolonged conflicts, and the limited success. So the wars weren't fought to be won outright, they were fought to be managed. Note the word managed. The technology and strategy with the traditional warfare constrained military innovations took a new direction. Precision guided missiles augmented the traditional artillery. Long range bombers became backbone for deterrence. Surveillance and the intelligence became critical. as wars were increasingly fought through the information and strategy. So instead of the brute force, nations focused on the rapid deployment, high tech warfare, and precision strike. So then came the walking on the tightrope between the politics and the military objectives. Fighting a war was no longer just about military strength, it was about political calculations. Every decision had the consequences beyond the battlefield. Push too far, and it could provoke a nuclear response. Military leaders had to balance objectives with diplomacy, often leading to compromises, half measures, and long drawn conflicts. So, wars became politically driven, fought under strict constraints, making clear victories almost impossible. It was a high stake game of chess where military strength was constantly checked by the diplomacy. The lessons for future. The impact on modern warfare. The Cold War's limited war taught the world some hard lessons. Conventional military power alone cannot win wars in the politically restricted environment. Flexibility and adaptability are critical. Military leaders must operate within constantly shifting political landscapes. Technology, intelligence, and precision strikes became more important than the large scale invasion. These, today, these lessons still shape modern warfare, from counterinsurgency in the Middle East to the modern drone warfare. The Cold War's influence is everywhere. Conflicts are still fought in limited ways, balancing military actions with the political strategy. The world never saw another world war, but the battles never stopped. The next section is on Afghanistan and the Second Persian Gulf War. The section examines the evolution of the operational art in the context of conflicts in Afghanistan 2001 and Iraq 2003. These wars, fought in the post Cold War era, highlight the complexities of the asymmetric warfare, nation building, and the modern joint operations. Now, firstly, about Afghanistan. Uh, it all started in October 2001. The US launched Operation Enduring Freedom, striking the heart of the Al Qaeda and Taliban. The goal was clear: eliminate Osama bin Laden, his network, and remove Taliban from power. The strategy relied on precision strikes, special forces, and support from Afghan allies like the Northern Alliance. Within weeks, the Taliban's stronghold fell, and the mission seemed like a success. But war was far from over. Fighting in the shadow, the challenge of asymmetric warfare. Unlike the conventional war, this was a war of hit and run tactics, ambushes, and insurgencies. The enemy had no uniform, no central command, no front lines. The rugged mountains and the deep valleys of Afghanistan became a perfect battlefield for guerrilla warfare. The Taliban and the Al Qaeda fighters hid in caves, blended into villages, and struck wherever they were least expected. The US relied heavily on its superiority, elite special forces, and advanced intelligence. But winning battles didn't mean winning the war. Again, the role of technology. It was something like the technology versus the terrain. The limits of modern warfare. The US had the most advanced military technology in history: drones, patrol the skies, striking insurgents from miles away. Precision guided missiles could eliminate targets within pinpoint accuracy. Advanced surveillance systems track enemy movements across the country. But technology couldn't solve Afghanistan's deeper problem. Local loyalty wasn't won with firepower. Destroying a target didn't mean eliminating the ideology behind it. For every Taliban leader killed, new recruits took their place. Despite high technological advantages, the war dragged on. As the years passed, the mission changed. The focus shifted from defeating the enemy to rebuilding a nation. The US tried to stabilize Afghanistan, building schools, improve infrastructure, and train a local army. Billions were spent and countless programs were launched, but the reality on ground was different. Corruption plagued the Afghan government. Tribal loyalties were deeper than political promises. The Taliban, though weakened, never disappeared. Instead of an easy victory, the US found itself trapped in the endless cycle of fighting, rebuilding, and fighting again. So now we come to the Second Persian Gulf War, 2003. In March 2003, US and coalition forces launched a full scale invasion of Iraq. The mission? Remove Saddam. The justification? Weapons of mass destruction and alleged ties to terrorism. But what started as a swift military campaign soon spiraled into one of the most complex and prolonged conflicts of the modern time. The US led coalition stormed into Iraq with clear military goal topple Saddam Hussein's regime. The world was told that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction and connections to the terrorist organization. But after the rapid collapse of the Saddam's government, those weapons of mass destruction were never found. What followed was a war that did not go as planned. The battlefield was changing, and the real fight just was beginning. The invasion began with the shock and awe, a strategy designed to overwhelm the Iraqi forces with precision strikes, air superiority, and rapid maneuvers. Air, land, and naval forces worked together in perfect coordination. The Iraqi military collapsed in just weeks. The world watched as Baghdad fell, Saddam went into hiding, and victory seemed near. But winning the battle was only half the war. The real challenge was what came next. Insurgency. The war takes a dark turn. With Saddam Hussein gone, Iraq plunged into chaos. The power vacuum led to the rise of insurgent groups, sectarian violence, and terrorist attacks. Sunni and militias clashed, and extremist groups like the Al Qaeda in Iraq gained strength. US forces found themselves fighting an enemy that did not wear a uniform, did not follow conventional tactics, and could disappear into the population. This was no longer a traditional war. This was counterinsurgency. The counterinsurgency or the operational roles in this fighting the hidden enemy. The strategy shifted. Winning the war now meant winning over the people, hearts and minds. Campaign aimed to protect civilians and rebuilding infrastructure. Intelligence driven targeting helped identify insurgent networks. Local Iraqi forces were trained, hoping they could take the control of their country. But every victory was followed by new challenges: suicide bombing, roadside IEDs, and attack on coalition forces. The longer the war dragged on, the harder it became to define what victory even looked like. As months turned into years, the flaws in post invasion planning became clear. There was no clear exit strategy. Sectarian violence grew worse, making stability near impossible. US struggled to balance military actions with political solutions. What began as a swift invasion had now become a long and costly occupation. What we have learned. Firstly, the political objectives matter. Military success means nothing without clear political goals. A lack of post conflict planning led to the prolonged instability. Then the asymmetric warfare is the future. Modern conflicts aren't always fought on battlefields. Decentralized enemies, guerrilla tactics, and cyber warfare have changed the game. Technology can't solve everything. Drone, precision strikes, the advanced surveillance help, but they could not replace local intelligence and the political solution. The war today requires a balance of military strategy and diplomacy. The Iraq War reshaped how wars are fought and how they end. It wasn't just about weapons and army, it was about politics, culture, and human cost of conflict. And its effects are still felt today. The lessons of Iraq will shape the future of warfare. So we come to the end of this chapter. Thank you.